I want to say a word before I get started on the trial. Last week, those of you who maybe weren't here, but maybe have heard about it, is that we started the trial of God. Last week was the prosecution. This week is the defense. Here's the good news if you missed any of it, or those at home, if you missed it. This week, hopefully on Tuesday, we will send out both the prosecution and the defense in a clip. And what that will do is that will let you see it, because next week we're going to hear from the jury. That's you. We're going to have a dialogue about this issue of human suffering and where is God in the midst of it. And so I want to make sure that everyone's prepared who wants to be able to have that opportunity to see both of that. Okay? So we'll start that as well. And it's based on the fact that during World War II, I mentioned last week, during the a time in which the Jews were being persecuted and they found themselves in concentration camps, rabbis put on a trial of God, asked where God was in the midst of the suffering. This was captured in a book by Eli Wiesel named The Trial of God. And he recounted a lot of this imagery that he saw firsthand as a child in the concentration camp. And so I welcome you now into the second part, that is the defense. So members of the jury, today we stand to defend not just a figure, but the very essence of faith itself. The God who has been charged with abandoning his creation, allowing undue suffering, and failing to uphold his covenant with humanity. Now the prosecution's case had painted a bleak picture, highlighting the tragedies, the injustices, the suffering that had plagued the world. They presented their case, had testimony. We're going to hear our own testimony today, a different perspective. One that will show a God who never abandons his people, even in the darkest hours. Will demonstrate that suffering, well, painful, has been a crucible by which faith in individuals, faith of individuals, faith of nations has been refined. And I'll present to you today witnesses whose lives testify not to a distant or indifferent deity, but to a God who is present, who provides, who redeems. Where is God in the midst of suffering? Amid this questioning, in the very act of putting God on trial, it's the relentless search for meaning, for justice, for God. And it's there that we discover faith, love, compassion, and a humanity that is bound together by all of these things. Today we'll hear from witnesses who, in the face of overwhelming pain and suffering and loss, found that God was not absent, but rather was preparing for a deeper understanding of God's own sovereignty, of God's own care, of bringing forth goodness in the midst of the pain. We'll hear of God's providence, a God who can take even the most unjust circumstances and use them for good. A providence that is often seen most clearly in hindsight in the weaving together of events that seem, well, at the moment, to be nothing but tragedy. We'll hear of a God who strengthens and sustains, who transforms suffering into a powerful witness to God's own grace and glory, where strength is found not in avoiding suffering, but in enduring with it in faith. You see, we'll show that God never failed his people. We'll demonstrate that in every age, through every trial, and in every moment of despair, God's been at work. guiding, providing, redeeming his creation. The truth we'll reveal is that suffering, rather than disproving the existence of a just and loving God, points us to the profound reality that God's ways are higher than our ways, that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. We ask you to listen. Listen with open hearts and minds as we present our case. But before we hear from our witnesses, I too offer into evidence events in history that even in the midst of life itself poses serious questions about the love and grace of God. The attack on 9/11. September 11th, in which terrorist attacks resulted in the collapse and loss of life. And was there in which the human response in the aftermath, first of the first responders, the brave firefighters, the police, those who showed extraordinary bravery, risked their own lives, but didn't stop there. Volunteers came from around the country, gathered together to stand with those who were suffering. In Gander, Newfoundland, a small town became a beacon of humanity as planes were diverted there and 7,000 passengers had to have a place to stay. And they opened up their schools, their homes, their community shelters, food for strangers, just to show love and compassion, generosity. Didn't stop there. The tsunami of 2004 in the Indian Ocean, in which killed over 230,000 people. But the global response was profound. Billions of dollars and millions of people came together to supply food and care, to provide help and rescue, to provide medical assistance and rebuilding efforts, an unprecedented international cooperation. People of all faith came together. And out of it, an early warning system that would forever change the way people understood and were prepared for tragedies. Or in Haiti in 2010, in which a 7.0 magnitude earthquake caused widespread destruction and death, 230,000 people killed. The world responded, came together, doctors, nurses, just average people, providing food and shelter, supplies. They were there to be the hands and the feet and the eyes of God. The Fukushima nuclear disaster, following an earthquake in Japan and a total meltdown of a nuclear power plant. Over 50 people donned suits, faced radiation even at the point of their own death to save people in their community, to go into the midst of the catastrophe. But didn't stop there. Engineers from all around the world gathered to address this issue. People risking their lives, people providing supplies, all to come to support one another. It didn't stop there, though. Throughout the world, throughout history, throughout time, people have shown through their faith and trust and the promises of God what it meant to be the people of God, to trust even in the midst of darkness, even in the midst of World War II, even in the midst of desolation and isolation. Towns like Les Chambon in France, who worked tirelessly to hide Jewish people from being captured, even at their own persecution. These examples highlight that in the darkest times, in the most difficult struggle for life itself, God stood with God's people, that the bravery, compassion, and solidarity came through as sunlight in the midst of the clouds. They remind us that this power of God, of faith, of love, of hope can overcome any adversity there is. And so, friends, I invite you to listen now as I call my first witness. And so I'd like to invite Joseph to come to the stand.
I brought some notes because, I'm a few hundred years old now. I was the 11th of 12 sons. My father, Jacob, loved me more than any of my brothers. He gave me a special robe, a coat of many colors. I'm wearing it today. Let's see. As a result, it deepened my brother's resentment. I had dreams in which my brothers bowed down to me. When I shared these dreams, it only fueled their jealousy. One day they conspired against me. They stripped me of my robe and threw me into a pit. Later, they sold me to a caravan of Ishmaelites who took me to Egypt. There, I was sold as a slave to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials.
It must have been devastating in your life. Your life in Egypt, as you describe, is far from easy. You were falsely accused and imprisoned. How on earth did you cope with these injustices?
I dreamed you might ask me that question. Yes, life was incredibly difficult. I went from being a favored son to a slave, and then to a prisoner, all because of false accusations. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce me, and when I refused, she accused me of assaulting her. I was thrown into prison, and even though I had done nothing wrong, through it all, I held onto my faith. I held onto my faith in God. I believed that somehow He had a plan for me. In prison, I continued to serve faithfully, interpreting dreams for fellow prisoners. God was with me even in the darkest times.
You mentioned that you interpreted dreams in prison. How did this gift eventually lead to your rise in power?
Well, one day the Pharaoh had a disturbing dream that none of his wise men could interpret. The chief cupbearer, who had been in prison with me, remembered my gift of dream interpretation, and he recommended me to the Pharaoh. With God's help, I interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, revealing that Egypt would experience 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. I advised Pharaoh to store up grain during the years of plenty to prepare for the famine. Pharaoh was so impressed that he appointed me as the second in command in charge of all of Egypt.
From slave to prisoner to the highest office in Egypt. Your journey is remarkable. Now, how did you view your suffering in light of this outcome?
Well, at first my suffering seemed senseless and unjust. But as time went on, I began to see that God had a purpose in all of it. When my brothers came to Egypt during the famine to buy grain, they didn't even recognize me at first. I could have sought revenge, but instead I revealed myself to them and said, "You intended to do harm to me, but God's intentions were good for me to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Through my suffering, God positioned me to save not only Egypt, but also my own family, the very ones who had betrayed me.
So you mentioned that God had a purpose for your suffering, and almost as a hindsight view of what it all meant. And so can you tell us, how was your faith influenced by your perspective on the trials that you faced?
Sure, my faith was the anchor that kept me going. Even when I was betrayed, enslaved, and imprisoned, I believed that God was with me. My faith helped me to see beyond the immediate pain and to trust that God was working out a greater plan. I came to understand that God can use even the most difficult circumstances for His purposes. My suffering was not in vain. It was part of a divine plan to preserve life and fulfill God's promises to my ancestors.
Joseph, your story is one of redemption and providence. I mean, despite the many hardships you endured, you maintained your faith and integrity. What message would you like to leave with us today about the role of suffering, your suffering, in God's plan?
The role of suffering. Well, I would say that suffering is often a part of God's plan, even when we can't see it in the moment. My life is proof that God can turn even the darkest situations into something good. As I said to my brothers, you intended to harm me, but God's intentions were good. Suffering may be difficult to endure, but it can lead to unexpected blessings and opportunities to fulfill God's purposes. We must trust in God's sovereignty and remain faithful, even when the road is hard.
Well, I thank you, Joseph, for spending time and giving your testimony today. I know you remind us that even in the midst of great trials, that God is at work shaping our lives and the lives of those around us. So you may step down.
Thank you.
I'd like to call my second witness. I'd like to ask Job, who testified for the prosecution, to come back up. Job, thank you for taking the stand. Job, as you previously testified, you are a man who has endured unimaginable suffering. You lost your wealth, your children, and your health. Yet, despite your personal tragedy, did you ever think of cursing God, as many might have in your position?
Never.
Can you remind us again about the pain you went through and how you responded?
My suffering was great. As you know, in a single day, I lost everything I held dear, my children, my servants, my livestock. Soon after, I was afflicted with painful sores from my head to my toes. My friends, rather than comforting me, accused me of some deep hidden sin, insisting that my suffering must have been some type of punishment from God.
Now, as you mentioned in your previous testimony, you were deeply anguished. Were you angry with God? Did you question God's justice?
I was deeply anguished, and I cursed the day of my birth and questioned why I was even brought into this world if my life was to end in such misery. I asked God why He allows the righteous to suffer. I said, why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power sometimes? Yet in all my questioning, as I've said before, I did not turn my back on God. Instead, I actually sought Him more earnestly, even though I couldn't understand His ways. I longed to be closer to God's compassion and care.
It's reported that you said, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I mean, how were you able to hold on to your faith in such a profound way?
My faith was indeed tested, but I held on to the belief that God is sovereign and just, even when I couldn't see it. I wrestled with the thought that perhaps God had abandoned me. But deep within me, I sensed God's promise to always be with me no matter what. I knew that God's ways are higher than my ways. I realized that my understanding and perspective is limited, and I cannot fully grasp the divine plan for my life or for the world.
You also testified about your friends' accusations, insisting that your suffering was a result of your sin. How did you respond to their accusations?
I knew in my heart that although I certainly was not perfect, I certainly could not have committed any sin that had warranted this level of suffering that was heaped upon me. But I maintained my integrity, and I argued with my friends, stating that I would not deny my integrity, I would maintain my innocence, and would never let go of it. But even in my defense, I acknowledged that we are all at the mercy of God, and that his wisdom far surpasses ours.
And after all your questioning and your suffering, God finally answered you and out of the world when you perhaps could share with us what that was like.
When God spoke, he did not give me direct answers. Instead, he reminded me of his creation, of the vastness of the universe, and the intricacies of life that are beyond human comprehension. He asked me where I was when he laid the earth's foundation, who shut the sea behind the doors, and who gives orders to the morning. It made me realize the greatness of God and the smallness of human understanding. I then said, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to even know or comprehend.
And in the end, God restored that which you had lost and even more. I mean, how did this restoration affect your view of God and your own suffering?
Well, certainly the restoration was a blessing, but the greater gift was the deeper understanding for me of who God is. My suffering led me to a profound encounter with the divine. As I had mentioned in my earlier testimony, I came to see that God is not only just but also merciful, and that he walks with us through our suffering, even when we cannot see him. I said, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. My story is a testament to the fact that God is present in our pain, and that ultimately he is the God of restoration and our hope.
Indeed. I thank you again, Joe, for spending time with us today and sharing your testimony and demonstrating that in the midst of profound suffering, faith in God led you to a deeper understanding of his purpose and a renewed sense of hope. You may step down.
Amen.
I'd like to call my next witness, Ruth, to the stand. Good morning, Ruth.
Good morning.
Ruth, would you please for us describe your relationship with Naomi? Now, we heard from Naomi last week.
Well, Naomi is my mother-in-law. I was married to her son, Mahlon. My husband's family was from Bethlehem, but due to the famine in Bethlehem, Elimelech, Mahlon's father, decided to move his family to the country of Moab. Now, that's where we met and became married, and then tragedy struck. My father-in-law died, and then my brother-in-law, and then my husband, Mahlon. We were devastated, and we didn't know what to do.
Now, after the death of your husband, you chose to stay with your mother-in-law, Naomi. And even though she returned back to her hometown, Bethlehem, you went with her. You followed her, leaving behind your own family, your own people, leaving your own gods. Why? What gave you the strength to make that choice?
Well, it was really hard. But I had come to know God, the God of Israel, through Naomi. And despite the bitterness she felt, I saw that faithfulness to God in her life. I'd come to trust in that God as well. And I said to her, where you go, I'll go. And where you lodge, I'll lodge. And your people shall be my people. And your God, my God.
So your faith led you into a foreign land and a new life. I mean, how did God respond with that sense of renewed faithfulness that you had?
Well, it was very difficult, but God provided for me in a very unusual way. I found favor in the eyes of a man named Boaz. He redeemed me and he married me, and through our marriage, I became part of the lineage of David, the king of Israel, and ultimately the Messiah, Jesus Christ.
Even breaking through those boundaries and barriers, he took that on. And so even in your loss and suffering, you found redemption and new purpose through God's providence.
Yes, God was faithful to me. And while at times I couldn't see that path ahead, God, turned my sorrow into joy.
Well, thank you, Ruth. I truly thank you for coming and giving your testimony today as well. You may step down. I'd like to call my final witness. Is Paul present? I believe you also go by Saul, or did at some point. Paul, thank you for being here today. Your story is maybe one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of faith. I mean, you went from being someone who persecuted Christians fiercely to one of the most influential apostles of Christ. Can you share with this court your life before you encountered Christ?
Of course. I was born Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee of Pharisees, as I often say. I was zealous for the traditions of my ancestors and deeply committed to the law of Moses. I saw the followers of Jesus as a dangerous sect, a threat to the purity of our faith. My mission was clear: to eradicate this movement. I was present and approved of the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, and I went from house to house dragging off men and women to prison. I was on my way to Damascus with letters of authority to arrest any who belonged to the way when everything changed.
It's that journey to Damascus that marked a pivotal moment in your life. Would you describe for the court, please, what happened and how it changed you?
As I neared Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and I heard a voice say, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" I asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The voice replied, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." I was blinded by the light and had to be led by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days I was without sight, neither eating nor drinking, overwhelmed by the revelation that the very one I had been persecuting was indeed the Messiah.
And so what happened next? How'd you go from being a prosecutor to becoming one of the most fervent apostles of the very faith you once sought to destroy?
Well, the Lord sent a disciple named Ananias to me. He laid his hands on me, and something like scales fell from my eyes. I could see again, both physically and spiritually. I was baptized immediately. From that moment on, my life's purpose was entirely transformed. I began to preach the very gospel I had tried to extinguish, proclaiming Jesus as the Son of God in the synagogues. My former allies among the Pharisees became my enemies, and I soon found myself persecuted for the faith I once despised.
And you faced many hardships as you spread that gospel throughout the Roman Empire. Would you share some of those challenges that you encountered and how they shaped your ministry?
Indeed, my journey was filled with suffering. I was beaten, imprisoned, stoned, shipwrecked, and constantly in danger from both Jews and Gentiles. I was often hungry, cold, and weary, but I counted all these as nothing compared to the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. In my weakness, I found the strength in him. I wrote to the Corinthians, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." These trials served to deepen my faith and dependence on God, and they allowed me to comfort others with the comfort I received from Christ.
And despite all the suffering and the adversity that you endured, you continued to spread the gospel with unwavering commitment. What kept you going?
It was the grace of God that sustained me. I was driven by a deep conviction that nothing, neither death nor life, angels nor demons, present not future, nor any powers could separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. I understood that my life was no longer my own. I had been bought with a price. I had been shown such great mercy that I could not help but share that mercy with others, no matter the cost. I considered my present suffering not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us.
Your writings provided profound insights, Paul, into the nature and suffering and the Christian life itself. Now, how do you see your hardships in light of your faith and your mission?
I see them as part of God's plan. Suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. My chains, my beatings, my trials, they were all opportunities to share in the sufferings of Christ and to bring the message of salvation to others. I have learned to be content in any situation, knowing that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Even in my weakest moments, his power is made perfect.
Paul, your testimony is a powerful witness to the transformative power of God's grace. What final message would you leave us today about the enduring life of suffering and adversity?
I would say this: if God is for us, who can be against us? My life is a testament to the truth that God can take the greater adversary and turn him into a vessel for his glory. My story is not one of human strength or perseverance, but of God's unrelenting grace and mercy. No matter what trials we face, we can trust that God is working all things for the good of those who love him. Our sufferings are temporary, but the glory that awaits us is eternal.
Paul, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your life and your words as you continue to inspire us as we too navigate our own faith in the midst of adversity. You may step down. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense rests.